Ekeni is a young man who has developed a habit of bringing a young girl to a hotel every day to satisfy his intense sexual desire. It has become such a routine that he can no longer do without it. This is also his way of escaping his fear of being alone. At 32 years old, he is a fairly accomplished and financially stable man. His only problem is his intense sexual desire. His friends have tried several times to persuade him to get married, but he is rather obsessed with the idea of marrying a virgin. However, in his town, many women engage in activities that are not very religious, such as prostitution, casual encounters, and other things. Ephora and her sister Ushi are very close and inseparable. They always support each other and help each other all the time. Despite Ushi being 23 years old, she bears a striking resemblance to her 25-year-old sister. They are sometimes mistaken for twins. One day, when Ephora fell ill, she suggested to her sister to prostitute herself like she did to meet their needs. Despite their strong bond and breathtaking resemblance, they decided to lead completely different lives. While the elder prostituted herself, her sister always promised to keep her virginity until marriage. At first, Ushi did not want to, but her sister threatened to kick her out if she didn't, as in her condition she no longer had money, and what her sister gave her was not enough. Although she desperately wanted to keep her virginity and stay true to her beliefs, she reluctantly decided to play along with her sister. Dressed by her sister in very extravagant and sexy clothes and accessories, she stood by the roadside, and a very expensive car soon stopped in front of her. When the window lowered, it was Ekeni behind the wheel, asking how much she wanted for the night. Reluctantly, she finally stated her price. In the car, she tried to smile at Ekeni's compliments, even though her facial expression often betrayed her. Seeing the young woman's troubled expression, Ekeni suggested they relax a bit in a club before heading to a hotel. He promised to pay her double her price, and she had no choice but to accept. He offered her drinks despite her reserved demeanor, and Ekeni quickly guessed that she must be new to this kind of activity. Ushi made all these efforts to avoid being thrown out by her sister. Where could she go? She eventually plunged into drinking, getting so drunk that Ekeni took the opportunity to take her to the room he had reserved. After her bath, Ekeni noticed that the girl's drunken state did not help, but he decided to proceed despite it. Ushi kept saying she was a virgin and was doing it only to avoid her sister's punishment. Annoyed, he finally ordered her to be quiet. "You are too drunk," he said. "When we are done, you can collect your money from the table." That night was different. Unlike his usual routine, Ekeni decided to engage in foreplay. He did not just go straight into her as he did with the other girls. She was special. Despite his protection, Ekeni was really enjoying this moment. The girl's body was unlike that of most of the girls he'd met. Eventually, they both fell asleep. The next morning, Ekeni strangely noticed that she wasn't in bed. She'd already left. But that wasn't the only surprise. There were traces of blood on the bed, and that's when he realized that the girl was telling the truth about her virginity. He felt bad about taking a girl's virginity for money. He found her necklace on the bedside table. He decided to give it back to her and apologize. He took his car and set off in search of her. For her part, Ushi, feeling bad about what had happened, went home rather than meet the young man's eyes again. Once home, she handed the money over to her older sister, who was very happy. Although the expression on her face showed her suffering, she couldn't contain her joy at the immense sum of money she was holding. While her sad sister took refuge in her room to cry, Ephora made her understand that she would get used to it over time, and that beginnings were always like that. Ekeni searched in vain for the young girl, but he was forced to return home to go to work. All day long, he couldn't stop thinking about the girl's ordeal the other night and kept feeling guilty. After work, he decided to try his luck by going to the roadside where he had found her. But unfortunately, she wasn't there. None of the girls present knew her. The only thing he had of hers was her necklace. Weeks went by with no news. The young man, who usually spent all his evenings with girls, managed to resist for 2 weeks. He couldn't stop thinking about the sweetness and incredible story of the young woman. After his futile searches, he decided to resume his usual life. One evening during his sexual act, he had the impression of seeing Ushi. The resemblance was striking. But unlike Ushi, this young woman was not as innocent and sweet. Unable to shake off thoughts of the young girl, he decided to pay his adventurer and spend the evening with his friends. Ekeni was lost in his thoughts. But how could he explain to his friends that he was in love with a girl he had met only one night without them mocking him? Felix noticed his lack of festive mood and decided to comfort him. He showed him photos of a girl. This time, Ekeni wasn't interested. But one detail caught his attention. The girl was wearing the same necklace as Ushi. He then asked his friend to send him the profile photos of Ephora. Once home, he hurried to check the profile and seeing the strange resemblance, decided to note the number at the bottom. Despite the calls, Ephora didn't answer. He decided to call back later. The next day at the office, he dialed the number, and this time Ephora answered. "Hello, this is Ekeni. I am really sorry about the other night. I didn't believe you, and I feel so guilty. I shouldn't have insisted when you told me you were a virgin." Realizing who it might be, Ephora decided to play along. She asked how he got her number, and after a few exchanged words, they decided to meet. On the scheduled day, despite his doubts, the strange resemblance left him no other choice. He politely apologized for his actions and advised her not to return to that place. That's when Ephora said, "I have nowhere else to go. It's the only way for me to avoid being thrown out by my aunt." Touched by her story, Ekeni offered her a lot of money for lodging and even starting a business. After thanking him, she left. Once home, Ekeni was convinced that there wasn't the same connection as with Ushi. This one was far too extroverted. Ephora, on the other hand, was so happy. "I have a lot of money. I can even start a business. Besides, I could also marry this incredible and handsome man," she said excitedly. One day, Ushi caught her packing. "Where are you going?" she asked. "I'm making my own way," she replied aggressively. "This place is no longer fitting for me." Despite her sister's questions about where she was going, she left without saying a word. She opened a clothing and jewelry business. Even though Ekeni sometimes called to check on her, there was always something that bothered him. But he still invited her to his place and showed her where he lived. Ephora could already see her life changing. One day at the office, Ekeni noticed his office in disarray and took it out on his secretary. She explained that they no longer had cleaning staff and that she had tried to do it herself. He then ordered her to put up a notice outside to hire a cleaning lady. Desperately looking for a job, Ushi didn't hesitate for a second to apply. She was very happy when the secretary told her she could start the next day. While she was cleaning, she accidentally dropped a piece of paper and hurried to pick it up. That's when her eyes met Ekeni's. They recognized each other immediately, and embarrassed, Ushi decided to flee, but the young man stopped her. She apologized with the same gentleness he remembered. Even at a simple touch, he recognized her. "What are you doing here? What about your business?" The young girl kept repeating, "I'm sorry, let me go." That's when Ekeni reassured her, offered her a seat, and asked if she had a twin sister. She replied, "I have an older sister. We look a lot alike, and sometimes people mistake us for twins and even confuse us." Ekeni took out his phone and showed her a photo. "This is your necklace in the photo, isn't it? You left it on the bedside table the other night." "Where did you get this photo?" she asked, surprised. "That's not important," replied Ekeni. "I want to apologize for what happened the other night," he continued. "I shouldn't have continued when you told me you were a virgin. I thought you were just very drunk and didn't know what you were saying." Although Ushi explained that he didn't need to apologize since he had kept his word, he asked for information about her. "Can you give me your number?" But Ushi didn't have one. "Where do you live?" She was unable to give him a fixed address. While she wanted to continue her work, the young man stopped her. He took her to buy a phone and asked her to take him to her place. Once there, the first thing that caught his attention were the photos of the two sisters on the wall and the desperate state of the room. He then understood, thanks to the young girl's explanations, that she couldn't afford to pay rent, and that the next day her landlord was going to throw her belongings out since she hadn't paid. They tried to contact the landlord to ask for leniency, but in vain. They had to abandon the idea. But that wasn't all. Ekeni really wanted to help the young girl. He packed her things to take her to his place until he could find a lawyer and a house for her. Letting her live in that room again was out of the question. Despite the young girl's embarrassed and overwhelmed look, nothing stopped him. Ushi didn't understand anything, and Ekeni explained that he wanted nothing in return but to find her a house through his lawyer. He also confided that he liked her and had even fallen in love with her. But he reassured her that he would respect her decision and wouldn't force her. The next day, they visited several apartments, but the young woman didn't want any despite their clean and pleasant state. "Why spend so much money when I can just stay with you?" She began to trust Ekeni. She suggested, "I will stay with you, but you have to promise to always respect my privacy." Surprised but happy at the same time, Ekeni agreed and told her he wouldn't do anything if she didn't want to. She smiled and replied, "So if I wanted to, you would?" "Of course, I love you sincerely and I'm serious," he replied sarcastically. "I've changed since that day. I'm calmer and no longer engage in one-night stands. It may seem like nothing, but it's true. And it's thanks to you." He shared his story with her. Curious, he asked her to tell him her story. "I am an orphan of both father and mother. After our parents died, my sister and I decided to leave the village and move to the city to make a better life for ourselves. She managed to find a place to live, and we both stayed there. She often made much more money than I did because, unlike me, she worked as a prostitute in the streets, so she constantly covered the expenses. Everything changed when she fell ill and was unable to pay for groceries. That's when she threatened me to do what she did if I didn't want to end up homeless." Ekeni tried to comfort her while she cried and explained that he also had bad luck with women because they were only interested in him for his money. "It's quite common for me to be robbed," he said. "I thought it would be better to choose a girl from the street rather than stay with women who only wanted wealth." After long conversations, they got to know each other better. Days went by, and Ephora kept calling Ekeni, but he didn't answer. He no longer wanted to deal with her lies. He and Ushi had become good friends. One day, Ephora decided to visit him since he wasn't taking her calls. While the two friends were chatting, someone knocked on the door. It was Ephora. Surprised, she wondered what Ushi was doing there. "Why are you here?" she asked angrily. "I live with Ekeni," she replied. "Why?" she retorted. "Ekeni offered to help me, and since I had nowhere else to go, I accepted." "And why did you take her in?" She now addressed Ekeni. "Unlike you, I don't want to abandon her. Since you left her and pretended to be her, I'm doing what a normal person would do." "You, follow me," Ephora said. "She's not going anywhere," Ekeni replied. Ushi didn't understand anything. She was just a spectator of the scene. "While you were lying to me and pretending to be your sister, did you ever think I'd meet her? Now get out of my house. She doesn't want to follow you." Ephora left, red with anger. But not wanting to give up, she went to the village and told lies to their aunts and uncles, who rushed to the city. They all went to Ekeni's house, but he wasn't there. To extort money from him and take advantage of his wealth, they decided to wait for him. When Ekeni came home, he was surprised to see so many people at his place. The uncles introduced themselves as Ushi's relatives. They told him that their traditions didn't allow their daughter to live with him if they weren't married. "Oh, I'm sorry for breaking your rules, but I really want to marry Ushi. I sincerely love her." Ephora didn't know where to stand. How was this possible? Delighted, their uncles and aunts invited him to the village to discuss the dowry. He promised to visit the village to learn about the necessary arrangements for the marriage. He also gave them a large sum of money for their transportation, and very pleased, they left. Having no choice, Ephora was very angry, but had to leave. "Why did you say you wanted to marry me without knowing my opinion?" Ushi asked after the others had left. "It was the best thing I could think of," Ekeni tried to explain. After a heavy argument, she went to the bedroom. Ekeni joined her and kept trying to explain his love for her and his deep sincerity, but she wouldn't listen. He then left and decided to let her live peacefully as they were. When he left, Ushi ran and grabbed his hand. "I'm sorry for my behavior. I love you too, Ekeni. I've learned to love you, and I want to marry you." At these words, Ekeni was overwhelmed with joy. He couldn't believe his eyes. They kissed. Meanwhile, Ephora didn't want Ushi to benefit alone from such a wealthy man, so she decided to call her sister and told her that Ekeni was hiding a big secret. When she asked her to explain, she said, "Don't worry, I'll give you all the details." Ushi was now very worried. She and Ekeni planned to go to the village for the wedding despite everything. He integrated perfectly with his future in-laws, and they got along very well. But Ushi still felt uncomfortable deep down. One day, her sister called again. "Listen to me, Ushi. I'm your sister, and I have to protect you. Ekeni has a big secret he doesn't want to tell you. He has an incurable disease." Ushi was sad and wondered how he could hide such a thing from her. Once home, she wanted to know Ekeni's version. She didn't want to believe it until she heard it from him. She caught her husband on the phone, saying he needed money to pay for medications because he was very sick. This time she believed it could be true. "So Ekeni has HIV, as Ephora told me." Her heart pounded. She went to the bedroom and started crying seriously. Why hide such an important thing from me? And why was he urgently asking for these medications? In fact, Ekeni needed the medications for Ushi's uncle, who was sick. He didn't want anything to disrupt their wedding, so he thought it was best to buy them urgently since the wedding was near. Unfortunately, Ushi had only heard a few words of the conversation. She thought the medications were for Ekeni, and that he indeed had an incurable disease. She didn't have the strength to ask Ekeni further. She was truly in love and wondered what their married life would be like. She called her sister and confirmed that it was true. Ephora, who knew very well that it wasn't true, played along and convinced her to leave the house quickly before Ekeni could infect her. Frightened, she decided to leave that night. Ephora promised to wait outside when she left. She was torn between staying for her love for Ekeni, but also scared for her health. If she saw Ekeni, it would be hard for her to leave, so she decided to run away without him knowing. She was surprised by Ekeni, who was outside making phone calls. He asked her where she was going at such a late hour with bags. She then decided to tell him what was bothering her. "I can't stay with you because you have an incurable disease, and you hid it from me." "What?" exclaimed Ekeni. "Who told you that? Why didn't you ask me instead of leaving?" "Ephora told me, and I also heard your phone conversation where you said you urgently needed medications." Ekeni started to laugh. "The medications are for your uncle. It's to avoid any problems during the marriage. But you decided to believe your sister over me. If you don't trust me, then I won't come back. I can't marry someone who doesn't trust me. I've proven that I love you, but you still don't believe me." Ushi realized he was sincere and not lying. She understood she also needed to apologize. Ephora, seeing no signs, began to call her, but Ushi didn't answer. She turned off her phone. She then joined Ekeni in the bedroom to ask for forgiveness, and when he wanted to leave, she romantically held him from behind. She kissed him, and he said, "To forgive you, I need more than a kiss." She blushed at his words, and he teased, "I need your love and your trust." She smiled, and then hinted at something more intimate. Ekeni replied that it would only be with her consent, and that she shouldn't worry about it. She said, "I give my consent, but there's one condition. You have to catch me first." They started running around the house. Tired, they sat on the couch, out of breath. Ushi leaned in and kissed Ekeni passionately. It became more intense. Ekeni held her by the waist, and they moved to the bedroom. As he touched her tenderly, his heart began to beat faster. Ekeni could hear Ushi's heart pounding in her chest, and as they went on, he whispered reassuring words of love. They let themselves be carried away by their feelings and love. Ephora, unable to wait any longer, left. The next morning, Ekeni woke up early to surprise his beloved. He made her eggs, toast, and fruit, and placed it on the bed while she was still asleep. The smell woke her, and she was deeply touched by Ekeni's gesture. They had breakfast together, and a beautiful day lay ahead. Before leaving, he asked her to rest because, upon his return, they would go shopping for their wedding preparations. How could she be unhappy? He was so attentive and kind. On his way to work, Ekeni decided to call Ephora and ask her to stop interfering in their lives. Her influence on her sister was too much, and it threatened their marriage. To his great surprise, she said she also wanted to spend a night with him and wanted a lot of money. Without even thinking, he categorically refused. She then said that was the condition if he wanted to marry her sister, and that if he hadn't asked her to leave that night, they would never have met. "Wow!" he exclaimed. "Instead of rejoicing in your sister's happiness, you seek to destroy it. You really have no heart." That was the last word. He ended the call. As if that wasn't enough, she called again and said she had changed her mind. Now she wanted to be pregnant by him, have money, and leave the city. No one would want you. Everyone knows what you do, Ekeni added. I will make your life difficult. Today, Ushi leaves me because she found a rich man. But I haven't said my last word, she continued, desperate. Ekeni couldn't believe it. She's really sick, he thought, and ended the call. When he got home, he found his Ushi, and as planned, they went to the city for shopping. On the wedding day, despite all of Ephora's efforts to cause chaos, all her attempts were in vain because Ekeni had prepared well. He had taken strong security measures. The wedding took place. The newly married couple returned to their home in the city. Ephora, having failed in all her plans, was completely disappointed. Not only was she now without a man, but also without money. She wasn't going to let them live happily. Ekeni must die, she thought. If I don't have a husband, then Ushi won't either, she said, a desperate smile on her lips. Meanwhile, the young couple was living their happiness. They were savouring their marriage. The next day, Ushi was seized by fear. She had a nightmare in which her husband was killed. She tossed and turned in fear and eventually woke her husband. He asked what was wrong and held her in his arms. Tell me what's bothering you, my dear. Ushi explained that she had just had a nightmare where he was killed. He reassured her that it was just a nightmare and that she shouldn't worry about it. She replied, I don't want you to go out today. I'm too scared. Listen, my dear, nothing will happen to me. I'll go to work and come back this evening as usual. He tried to reassure her as best he could. She reluctantly agreed. On the road, Ekeni saw two men fighting, blocking his way despite his honking. He eventually got out of the car, unaware that they were hired by Ephora. When he approached, they brandished their weapons and ordered him to follow them quietly if he didn't want a bullet in his head. Panicked, he obeyed, trembling. Under Ephora's amused gaze, he was beaten mercilessly. Please, Ephora, let me go. Think of your sister, Ekeni pleaded, but she didn't care. If I can't be happy, neither will she. The two men buried him alive in the bushes under Ephora's orders and left. He tried to struggle to save himself. Two women who were gathering wood noticed something unusual and eventually realized there was someone alive in the pit that needed saving. They managed to pull him out and quickly took him to the hospital. His condition was critical and his injuries were severe. Ushi, who couldn't stop thinking about her nightmare, tried in vain to reach her husband. She was panicking. She went to his office, but they informed her that he wasn't there. Her heart was pounding. Where could he be? Had something happened to him? She had so many questions but no answers. Desperate for answers, she called Ekeni's uncle, who asked her to be patient. 1, 2, 3, 4 hours passed, and still no news. They went to the police station to report his disappearance. Desperate, she called her sister, thinking she might know something. She told her that her husband hadn't come home and wasn't answering her calls. Ephora, celebrating her victory for her plan that she thought had succeeded, pretended to comfort her while secretly feeling very pleased. The next day, the police informed Ushi that they had found her husband's car, but that he wasn't in it. Panicked, Ushi started crying seriously. What happened to him, my God? She felt so guilty for not being able to stop him from going out that day. 4 days later, Ekeni finally woke up from his coma. The first thing that crossed his mind was his wife. He begged the medical staff to let him go, but they refused due to his health condition. He eventually found a phone and called his uncle to explain his ordeal and asked him to look after his wife. He asked his uncle not to leave her alone and not to tell anyone until he had fully recovered. He was curious to know how he had ended up there, and the nurse told him the story. You were buried alive. 2 women with golden hearts saw you and helped. They brought you here, she explained. Can I meet them? No, not at the moment, but once we have their news, we'll inform you. As usual, Ephora called Ushi again to ask if she had any news about her husband. No, her sister replied, and Ephora was very happy. I'll come to your place for a few days to comfort you, Ephora said. Ushi told her she was with her in-laws and couldn't receive visitors. After the call, Ephora exclaimed, "Oh, I'm so happy. My plan is working perfectly." One evening, Ekeni decided to surprise his uncle and wife. He could now leave the hospital a month later. When Ushi saw him, she was very happy. She ran into his arms. She asked why he hadn't informed her sooner and asked for details about his ordeal. He told her the story, and she was shocked to learn that her sister was the cause of his recent misery. What mattered now was that he was okay. Plus, Ushi had news to share. She was expecting a baby. The whole family was overjoyed. The couple slept very happily that night. The next day, they decided to go to the police station to tell the story. Ephora and her 2 accomplices were arrested. They were tried and sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. Behind bars, Ephora finally realized she had gone too far. But it was too late. It was no longer a time for regrets. She now had to face the consequences of her actions. The young couple could now live happily without fear. Ekeni couldn't stop thanking Ushi for the beautiful baby she had given him and all the love she provided daily. To thank her, he offered her a well-paying job so she could also be financially stable. Overwhelmed with joy, Ushi thanked him for making her who she was today and for understanding her without judging. They kissed each other, a sincere kiss full of gratitude. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and tell me in the comments which country you're following me from.